Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. We're here with the Friends of the Everglades live update. We're happy to have you join us if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. We're here today to talk about the session of the Florida legislature that we're now halfway through the 2023 annual session in Tallahassee. We met with you at the end of February to give you a session preview with some experts, and we're here with you today to give you a mid-session update. So before I introduce our guests, I just want to thank our sponsors, the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation, for making this live stream possible. And I also want to say that this live stream is part of the legislative accountability work that Friends of the Everglades is committed to. We know it can be really difficult to keep track of complex legislation that's pending in Tallahassee, but we also know that it has a direct impact on our quality of life, our economy, our environment in Florida. So we're committed to helping you understand what all of this fast-moving, complicated policy means for your life and in our backyard. So welcome, everybody. So now I'm going to introduce our guests. First, we have Matt DePaolis. Matt is Policy Director at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation in Southwest Florida, and he's going to bring us some unique perspective from that part of the state. Welcome, Matt.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. We also have Jane West, who is the Policy and Planning Director for 1000 Friends of Florida, which does excellent work on growth and development issues across the state. Welcome, Jane. Happy to have you today.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
And Gil Smart wears two hats. He's the Executive Director of VoteWater, and he is also the Policy Director at Friends of the Everglades. Welcome, Gil.
Thank you.
All right, so let me just orient you a little bit more to this session, and then we're going to go through a brief update. Gil will walk us through on bills we're tracking, good and bad. And then we're going to get into a conversation here. If you're watching live, either on Facebook or YouTube, you can pop a question right into the comments and we'll actually see those. And we're going to get to as many questions as we can during the last 15 minutes or so of the hour we have here. So again, we're halfway through the legislative session. Session began on March 7th. It's 60 days long, unless it's extended, which does happen some years. And this year, we knew pretty early on that growth issues were going to be a major concern. Last year, during the 2022 session, water policy ended up being the most urgent issue that we were tracking. Some of you might remember that Senate Bill 2508 popped up late in the game and we had to spring into action, and we did, with allies, end up getting a veto of that bad bill last year. So water policy was really the focus then. But this year we've seen, I think it's fair to say, an onslaught of bills related to development issues. And given the rapid pace at which Florida is growing and the increasing pressure on our dwindling natural resources, these bills are really important and have great consequences for Florida. So we're going to have some good updates for you too. Some of the worst bills related to water have stalled. Gil's going to talk about that. But some of these bad bills do have traction. So we'll be focusing on that during the next hour as well. So, without further ado, Gil, I'm going to hand it over to you to walk us through the bills we're tracking. What's on your radar and what do you make of it?
Sure. Thanks, Eve. So as you mentioned, what we had previously identified as the worst bills of the session, thankfully, aren't going anywhere. We'll get to the specifics on that in a minute, but I do want to note that Jane had said previously that you got to be careful with bills like this, because even if they aren't going anywhere this session, bad ideas in Tallahassee never die. They're like vampires. They keep coming back. So it's entirely possible that we're getting a preview of what we're going to see next legislative session. But here, I'm going to pull up my my slides here, and let's see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Slideshow. Can you see this?
Yes.
Able to see this? Okay. All right. Very good. Again, early on, we said we feared this was going to be the, quote, session of sprawl, and unfortunately, I think we were right about that. As you noted, many of the bills we identified early on as facilitating more sprawl, more reckless growth, more problems have been moving fast. And most of the bills that we thought would have a positive influence on, the environment, water quality here in Florida are, as usual, going nowhere fast. But let's take a quick look here at some of what we got. This now is probably the worst of the lot. This first one here, this House Bill 359, Senate Bill 540, local government comprehensive plans. The key feature of this is that citizens who challenge comprehensive plan or plan amendments and lose would have to pay the prevailing party's legal fees, the other side's legal fees. This cannot help but have a chilling effect on citizen engagement. We fear that people are going to be they're likely to be too intimidated to challenge some of these plans, even if they think they've got a really strong case, because if they lose, whammo, they're saddled with all these legal fees. So this is really egregious. And actually, Senate Bill 540 had been made worse by the addition of an amendment, which would have basically retroactively approved a very controversial proposal down in Miami-Dade County to build outside the urban development boundary. And it's like we took one of the worst bills of the session and made it worse. Yesterday, in its Rules Committee hearing, that amendment, there was another amendment that basically scuttled that amendment. So it made, we're back to square one. The bill was still terrible. It sailed through the committee, and now it goes to the House floor, or rather the Senate floor, Senate Bill 540. So again, this bill in particular seems to be all about getting those pesky citizens out of the way so the sprawl industry can do its thing. And as noted, that makes it one of the worst bills this session. Second up down here, House Bill 1515, Senate Bill 170, local ordinances, among other things, makes it easier for businesses to sue local governments when local governments enact ordinances that hit the bottom line. It also there's also some other provisions of this, which, for example, would any ordinance that is the subject of a suit has to be suspended. The enforcement is suspended until the suit is decided. This would also require cities and counties to produce a business impact estimate before passing an ordinance. So again, when you talk about some of these ordinances, you can think of things like maybe plastic bag bans or plastic straw bans. We saw a local attempt here in Stewart or something like that. If a business can argue that something like that creates enough of an impact on its bottom line, they can basically force the ordinance to be mothballed, and they can win up to $50,000 for it. So again, you're making it easier for businesses to go after local governments that may be, for example, passing ordinances relating to clean water or pollution control, that sort of thing. These are flying. House Bill 1515 is on the House second reading calendar. Senate Bill 170 already passed the full Senate back in March. Here we have House Bill 439, Senate Bill 1604, land use and development regulations. These bills had been really worrying because, among other things, they redefined sprawl to essentially mean nothing or everything. Sprawl was going to be just unplanned or uncontrolled development. And there were a lot of other provisions to this as well. There have been some changes to these bills. We've seen some committee substitutes. House Bill 439 has removed some of the references to sprawl, or rather 1604 has removed some of the references to sprawl. But we still have a very worrying redefinition in Senate Bill 1604 of urban service areas. Right now, an urban service area is an area that's served by urban services, roads, water, sewer. Well, under this legislation, it would be any area that's served by these public services, but also any area that might be served by these public services if it's paid for by local government or private entities, in other words, developers. So I don't see how that doesn't basically open up the whole of Florida to development. Again, if private developers are willing to pay for the extension of services, all of a sudden you're inside the urban service area. House Bill 439 is headed to the House floor. Senate Bill 1604 is in the Rules Committee. It was not on the agenda yesterday, but could be next week. And then down here, and this is an interesting one, House Bill 41, Senate Bill 856, Land Development Initiative and Referendum Process prohibits local initiatives or referendums on land development regulations. Current law prohibits an initiative or referendum process for any development order, but not land development regulations. This would change that. House Bill 41 flew through the process. It's on the House second reading calendar. But Senate Bill 856 was pulled from its hearing at the Community Affairs Committee on March 29th. Anecdotally, we're hearing that the sponsor didn't think that she had the votes. So it has not been rescheduled that I've seen. Please correct me, Matt or Jane. But it has not been rescheduled, which is a good sign. Although there's always a chance that if House Bill 41 passes the House, that could wind up getting tacked on as an amendment to some other unrelated legislation. So these are some of the good bills that we were tracking, and they really be going nowhere. House Bill 423, Senate Bill 1538 would implement many more of the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Senate actually, the Environment and Natural Resources Committee actually passed Senate Bill 1538 through the first committee stop, but gutted it with a strike-all amendment that basically, it's kind of worthless now, and it's had no more hearings, and House Bill 423 has had no hearings. 1425, on-site sewage treatment and disposal system inspections, hasn't gotten a hearing. The Safe Waterways Act, which would require owners of public bathing places to notify the local county health department after a failed water quality test, close the bathing place if necessary. You can see here, House Bill 177 passed one committee, no more hearings. Senate Bill 172 has had no hearings, so going nowhere fast. Some good news. Now, this is what we were talking about sort of at the top of the hour here. The session's worst bills have not moved. House Bill 1197 and Senate Bill 1240, land and water management, would effectively prohibit local municipalities from passing any ordinances that are looked to improve water quality or pollution management. We've talked a lot about these bills when they popped up on the radar screen. It was the subject of a lot of media coverage. Neither bill has gotten any hearings, which is good news, right? But again, as noted earlier, it's entirely possible that, even if these go nowhere this session, we could see them in a subsequent session. So, but thankfully, anyway, this session, because this would have just basically eviscerated any sort of local attempt to pass ordinances to deal with some of these crucial issues. So going nowhere fast, good. A couple other bills that could be helpful. House Bill 174, Senate Bill 192, the Everglades Protection Area requires comp plan or comp plan amendments within 2 miles of the Everglades Protection Area to undergo state coordinated review process and mitigate issues. You'll notice the little asterisk there, and that's because Senate Bill 192, I believe, was amended to apply only to Miami-Dade County. So if we're talking about the Everglades and Broward County, that doesn't count. So, and then last one here, and this just passed, the House bill just passed its committee stop this morning. Environmental protection, House Bill 1379, Senate Bill 1632. It creates the parameters of the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program, something that Governor DeSantis had called for in his Executive Order 2306. It requires municipalities and counties within BMAP areas to list the projects needed to hit their pollution reduction goals. There was some criticism of this in today's committee hearing, that it doesn't, it's not specific enough. We don't have sort of a list of numeric goals that we're supposed to hit. It's all very vague, but the proponents of this sort of touted it as nonetheless a step forward. And I suppose that it is. Florida's problem, I think, in a lot of cases is we don't have very specific numerical goals that we're supposed to be hitting. But at this point, I guess we got to take what we can get. So there's a lot of other bills that we're tracking, and I know the folks on this call are tracking, but those are the highlights. And again, I think Session of Sprawl, yeah, it's happening. And a lot of this legislation is frankly going to make it easier for the sprawl industry to run roughshod over Florida and local governments. So.
Thanks, Gil. So the legislation is flying fast. I know we just threw a lot at everyone who's tuned in, and we're going to zoom in on some of the bills where we remain cautiously optimistic that we can still make a difference in this second half of session. We want to highlight some of the most problematic components of this legislation and point out why, if you're watching this and you care about these issues, your voice can help us avoid the worst outcomes. So on that note, Jane, let's zoom in on Senate Bill 540, House Bill 359. You were at the Senate Rules Committee meeting yesterday. You're an attorney who's worked on these types of issues for years, environmental land use issues. So how do you foresee this legislation, if it is indeed approved, impacting development growth in Florida?
Yeah, thanks, Eve, for that. And I should note that the sponsor of this bill on the House side, Representative Duggan himself, is also a land use attorney with a development firm based out of Jacksonville, Florida, and that's Rogers Towers. And so he knows his stuff. He knows what he was doing when he drafted this bill, and it is very targeted. It is a very concerted effort, and he has stated this during committee hearings, kind of building on what was passed back in 2019, which was a very bad bill, House Bill 7103, that was kind of tucked into a larger omnibus bill in the last days of session. It never had any committee hearings, so there wasn't an opportunity to voice objections. And it passed, and that bill essentially provided for prevailing party attorney fees for development order challenges. So this one, the sponsor has argued, just kind of closes the loop and provides for prevailing party attorney fees for comprehensive plan amendment challenges. And in a procedural sense, he's right that the two often go together. You have development orders often travel with comprehensive plan amendments when you're looking at large land use changes throughout the state. And so I want to kind of provide an example. For example, if you're looking, and this is increasingly happening in our rural settings, our agricultural lands, farmland, and ranches throughout the state of Florida are exceptionally vulnerable to development because, quite frankly, it's just a lot cheaper to bulldoze everything down and build from scratch than it is to have good, smart development, which is infill development. Here at 1,000 Friends of Florida, we're always proponents of building up and not out. Unfortunately, that's a little bit more expensive. So developers very often just do this moonscape bulldozing of large tracts of land. And often we're not talking 50 acres, 100 acres. We're talking in the realm of 2,000 acres, 5,000 acres, tens of thousands of homes, single family homes. Each one, it's like that ticky-tacky little subdivision they all look the same. They've all got their pool in the backyard and their screened-in patio and the cul-de-sacs. And I'm sure anyone who has driven around the state of Florida has seen these changes happen. So let's say you have a 2,000 acre proposed development. You're going to have the development order and the comprehensive plan amendment traveling together through multiple public hearings as it travels through planning staff, planning and zoning hearings, potentially architectural review boards. It depends on your local government, but ultimately it goes either to the city commission or a county commission for approval. And while the public does get an opportunity to voice objections, those opportunities, I have to say, are extremely limited. Very often, public comment is limited to 3 minutes. And if there are a lot of speakers, that can get condensed down. I've seen it egregiously cut down to 30 seconds to voice your opinion. Some people can't really even get their name out of their mouth with that kind of time allotment. And so, yeah, you have an opportunity, but that really is a misrepresentation of the public's opportunity to really engage because of that limited time restriction. Whereas the developer applicant frequently is given sometimes no time restrictions whatsoever. Other local governments have restrictions like, a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute, half an hour are very common for the developer applicant to make their presentation. So after all of that, if the county commission is not responsive to the public input and they go ahead and approve of this 2,000 acre development, what are the options for a citizen that is concerned about that? Well, in the past, we have been able to initiate a comprehensive plan amendment challenge, and it's procedurally wonky. It goes through an administrative process. It doesn't go to circuit court, and it goes through the Division of Administrative Hearings. And even though it's an administrative process, it's still pretty much a full-blown trial. The administrative law judge is loosely adhering to the Florida Rules of Evidence. You have a hearing, you have expert witnesses, you have evidence that is taken, lay witnesses also testify, there's cross-examination, it's stressful, there's depositions. I mean, it's the whole kit and caboodle. It is a trial. Also, it is just as expensive as a trial. So these citizens, they would pay for folks like me. I did these citizen challenges. I had my own boutique, public interest, environmental, and land use law firm. until House Bill 7103 was passed. And I say that because that bill basically shut down my caseload. My clients were not willing to take on the financial risk of pursuing their cases because that bill passed. This bill is going to completely stop all sorts of citizen engagement. So these citizens that challenge comprehensive plan amendments, they pay for their own land use attorneys and their own expert witnesses and the accommodations to go to the trial and the depositions and the transcripts and the court reporters and you name it. They are paying for all of that, and it is expensive. Frequently upwards of $30,000, $50,000 for these challenges. That's for your own attorney. But if this bill passes, and it looks like it's going to, the prevailing party would be on the hook for the local government's attorney fees and for the developer applicant fees. Now, these developer attorneys frequently bill in the range of $600, $700, $800 an hour. So if you think about a full-blown trial for a developer's attorney, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, you may care just as much as the next person about the moonscape that has just been created in your backyard of thousands of acres being bulldozed. But do you actually care enough that you're willing to mortgage your house, forfeit your investment portfolio, give up your kids' college saving accounts, completely tap out your savings just because it really upsets you that people are not playing by the rules? Because that's the reality that people are going to have to face if this bill passes. Do I care that much about Florida, that much about my daily quality of life, that I'm willing to put it all financially on the line? The bill sponsors think, yeah, you should have some skin in the game. This is not skin in the game. This is like amputation of your entire net worth. So it's a very scary bill. I think the chilling effect that I am predicting is not anecdotal. I know from experience from my own client base telling me literally, the day before Governor DeSantis signed that bad bill into law, calling me up saying, dismiss my case, dismiss my case. I anticipate that we are going to have the same sort of reaction here. So, I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm speaking from experience. That this is really going to sever the ability for citizens across the state of Florida to have meaningful engagement in what our communities look like. And for those of us who, already live here and exist here and choose the communities that we are currently living in for their character, like if you have intentionally picked, a rural area because maybe your family has been there for generations, or maybe you like dark skies at night. Maybe you want that rural peace of mind and you like your little 2-lane country roads. Those are property rights too, and those get completely left out of the equation. These developers that are coming in, they very often do not own that 2,000 acres. It's a speculation. It's a speculative purchase with a contingency contract that it get approved. That they get their comprehensive plan amendment approved, that they get their development order approved. So they go through that entire process without actually having to purchase the land. It's all contingent speculation. So it's just a very unfortunate reality. And this bill is simply going to expedite the entire process and make it just financially so painful that I think it's going to forever change the landscape of Florida if it does not get vetoed. So those are my thoughts, Eve.
That's terrifying, Jane, but also important to know. And let's just be clear here. We're not talking about frivolous lawsuits. We're talking about challenges that are often very narrowly decided based on the sets of facts that are presented. Mm-hmm. So it's not fair to put a citizen on the hook if they lose in those narrow decisions often. So really concerning. And I just want to emphasize too that Friends of the Everglades remains strongly opposed to this bill. There was an argument made by the Senate sponsor, DeSiegli, yesterday that the Everglades concerns had been resolved because an amendment was removed that Gil mentioned. That's not the case, because what we're talking about here is a threat to all of Florida's natural resources, including the greater Everglades. So that's where we stand. I'm going to turn it now to Matt. Matt, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation also sent an action alert to supporters on Monday before this bill was heard. Why does SCCF stand opposed to this bill?
Well, I think Jane did a great job of laying out why we're opposed to this bill. The stifling effect that it has on everyday citizens also applies to citizen organizations like SCCF and like Friends of the Everglades and a lot of these partner organizations. Jane was talking about risking your mortgage of your house and your child's university funding potentially, but organizations like ours are also have to make the concentrated decision whether or not to risk bankruptcy if we're going to be challenging some of these comprehensive land use plans going forward if this bill were to pass. And we're sitting in a situation on the coast over here on the West Coast where we really need to be thinking about our development and making sure that the development going forward is intelligent and is concentrated and is not going to be putting people at risk who live in these coastal areas. We're fairly built out in parts of areas of South Florida. And I would consider us to be very built out in most of Southwest Florida, but when I look at a mangrove stand and a wetland that's protecting current residents there, I see the natural resources and the natural protection afforded by those mangroves when we're talking about a storm event like Ian that comes through and absolutely scours out entire communities. And it's disheartening to know that there's developers out there who are looking at the exact same wetland and thinking that that would be a great place for some more single family houses. And it's exactly why we need the ability as citizens and as citizen groups to stand in the way of that. And Jane laid it out perfectly in that 30 seconds is not enough time to lodge a complaint that actually gets to the heart of the risks associated with a lot of these development choices. So we need these other tools that are available to us. And you've said it yourself, this isn't about frivolous lawsuits. There's already protections in our legal system that stop frivolous lawsuits from working their way through the court. If a lawsuit is deemed frivolous, then those attorneys' fees will be transferred. So that protection is already built in, and no one takes a lawsuit lightly. I mean, everyone understands how expensive and time consuming and stressful these lawsuits are. So it's not like citizens are saying, oh, well, I like that field next to my house and I don't want it to be developed, so I'm going to take this lawsuit on myself, even though it's completely reasonable to put another building in there. That's just not what we're seeing on the ground here. And at a time when we're really starting to understand, especially in the wake of Ian, the importance of some of these natural spaces and these wetlands and these natural fringes that provide protections to our communities down here, we're starting to see leadership really understand that too. I would hate to see something like this, a tool like this, to have an engagement with citizen engagement that allows for these protections to go away so quickly and so cleanly that it will really stifle any sort of engagement by many of the people down here. And we're sitting at a place where not only in the wake of Hurricane Ian and ever increasing storms, but water quality is something that is at the forefront of everyone's mind. We've essentially been going through red tide events since Ian came through because we have all these land-based nutrients that are being flushed into the Gulf and feed these red tide blooms. They feed these blue-green algae blooms. And about 50% of that problem here in Sanibel and Captiva and Fort Myers is the Caloosahatchee. With the water and the nutrients that are coming directly out of Lake Okeechobee, down that waterway into the Gulf, providing a food source for the algae bloom. But while 50% of that comes directly from Lake Okeechobee, the other 50% is a watershed issue. And we're generating a lot of those nutrients right here in our own watershed. So if we are the people that are generating the problem, we need to be the people that are going to be fixing that problem as well. And that's going to take all stakeholders in the community working together to solve these problems. And it's going to take tools like being able to use the courts when it's appropriate, not for frivolous lawsuits, not to stop all development, but when it's appropriate to stand in the way of unsafe development needs to be an option that's left on the table. And 540 would take that away.
Thanks, Matt. That's really well put. And thanks for highlighting the nexus between land use planning and water quality. And we know you all have been going through it in Southwest Florida in terms of red tide and the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. So it's all the more important now as you're weathering the aftermath of that storm. So thanks for explaining that. I want to talk now about Governor DeSantis's executive order on the environment that was issued at the beginning of this year. This was the governor's second executive order on the environment. He rolled one out right after he was elected and took office in early 2019. So he issued another one this year as he set into his second term. And one part of that order, to zoom in on here, related to development. He directed the Department of Environmental Protection to partner with the Department of Economic Opportunity to, quote, improve local government long-term comprehensive planning that ensures sustainable growth. And it goes on a bit from there. So Gil, talk to us a little bit about how you see this order and this part of the order and how it comports or doesn't with some of the legislation that we're seeing and talking about.
Well, I was just going to say, you know what I don't read in the executive order? I don't read the term disempowering citizens. I don't read the term intimidating citizens, which is exactly what Senate Bill 540 would do. So are we to believe that the governor's priority is, in fact, sound comprehensive planning? Frankly, citizen engagement is a huge aspect of sound comprehensive planning. I mean, you could argue, I've argued, that the lawsuits filed in these instances like we're talking about are a key check and balance on growth, So if Governor DeSantis means what he wrote, means what he said, I don't see how he can favor a bill like Senate Bill 540, frankly. If you prioritize, look, development, as Matt just said, development is directly connected to water quality issues. Okay. The more reckless development that we have, the more pavement we have, the more runoff we have, the more problems we have. Okay. So Florida has a vested interest in doing it the right way. Look, everyone will acknowledge the huge economic aspect of the growth industry in Florida, the extent to which it's a key component of Florida's economy. We can say we wish it weren't that way, but it is. Given this, however, that we have absolutely to do everything in our power to ensure sound comprehensive planning, responsible comprehensive planning. And again, citizen engagement is a key aspect of that. When you have a bill like 540, again, it seems that the entire purpose of this bill is to intimidate citizens. Get the pesky citizens out of the way so the sprawl industry can do what the sprawl industry wants to do. And this is a very effective way of doing it. As Jane said, who's gonna take on the potential for tens of thousands of dollars and on the other side's legal fees just to fight something? How much do you really care? And are you willing to risk financial ruination, to stand up and say no? Who's going to do that? Very few people are going to do that. The governor laid out, his clean water priorities in Executive Order 2306. Okay. And again, among those, you have to have sound comprehensive planning as an aspect of that, right? Sound comprehensive planning has a direct impact on water quality throughout the state of Florida. Okay. If you don't have sound comprehensive planning, if you have reckless development and reckless planning, which I would argue this amounts to, you're going to have more water quality problems. This is not difficult. This is not brain surgery. Okay. So did the governor mean what he said? If he did mean what he said, what's he going to do if this bill lands on his desk, which it certainly seems like it's headed in that direction? Can a clean water, quote unquote, clean water governor sign a bill that's destined to result in dirtier water? That's sort of a key question here. So, it's interesting, we have this articulated set of priorities from the governor. But when you look at some of these bills, and 540, 540 is the most egregious of the bunch, perhaps, but there's a whole bunch of other bills along the same lines as we detailed going through the process. How do these match up? How are we going to see the application of these priorities that the governor has articulated? Or is this just words on a piece of paper that's meant to sort of assuage the likes of us?
Gil, I'm so glad you brought up that disconnect. And I would love for us to talk a little bit about that, because I'm seeing not only the disconnect between what the governor has put in his executive order and what the legislators are doing, but I'm also seeing a disconnect even within the leadership. Pasadomo and Speaker of the House Renner, and a lot of the Republican lawmakers are very much on board with the Florida Wildlife Corridor effort. I just attended a reception last night where you had a lot of Republican leadership in the room, hailing the great progress that the Florida Wildlife Corridor has been able to make. And yet there's like this really weird disconnect of, you understand how important the Florida Wildlife Corridor is for ecosystem linkages and corridor pathways for our most endangered species like the Florida panther and the Florida black bear. But then you have legislation that you are bulldozing through that would basically run completely counter to that objective. So it's like the two ships in the night.
Tell the twain meet. Exactly. No, exactly.
It's really bizarre.
You can't vote for conservation on one hand and vote against conservation with the other hand, but that's what we're seeing. That's frankly what we're saying. So
we're going to do a live stream again at the end of session, and we're going to have a really interesting discussion when we see how this turns out with 540. If it does land on the governor's desk, what will the governor do? So we will be tracking that closely. And so, Jane, I'm glad you brought up your presence in Tallahassee. You have been there most of the session. I'm just wondering what kind of responses you're getting from lawmakers when you raise these concerns. Florida used to be a leader in sound growth management in the whole country. What changed, and what are you hearing now?
Well, a lot of the lawmakers are very proud of the efforts that they're making when it comes to land conservation and Florida Wildlife Corridor efforts. So there's a lot of, patting themselves on the back. And, I'm going to be the first one to say that those efforts should be congratulated. Those are really good, strong efforts. For the first time ever, we're seeing really positive momentum towards funding land acquisition, making sure that that funding is in place on a consistent basis. And that is so critical for protecting Florida, because I think we've just come to the final realization that the only way we're going to save Florida's landscape is to buy it. We can no longer engage in these legal challenges. Litigation is not working. Lobbying is not working. The only way to save Florida is to buy it, put it into conservation easements, make sure that that land is protected in perpetuity. So I am heartened to see those efforts move forward. Those are, the reactions that I'm seeing from leadership on both the House and the Senate side. For the Democrats, I think, it's a very frustrating experience to be in a legislative session where you've got a supermajority. I'm seeing party line votes on many of the committee stops. And when you have a supermajority, you really don't have a good functioning democracy because you don't have engagement. You don't have good debate. It just steamrolls through. So that's why we're seeing these bills just move along super, super fast. There are no speed bumps. There are no brakes. So I think it's really unfortunate because at the end of the day, it's the citizens of Florida who are getting the short end of the stick there. And quite frankly, a lot of this stuff is really wonky. Yes, I'm in Tallahassee for the whole legislative session, but I don't know a lot of people who've really got the time or the energy to come to Tallahassee because it's like really far away from the rest of Florida. And there's just a real disconnect between the citizens on the ground and what they're telling me and what is happening in the legislature. So I try to communicate that, but it's challenging.
I just want to throw in one thing. Jane mentioned the lack of speed bumps. The House Rules Committee, which I watched on the Florida channel yesterday, was scheduled to be 2.5 hours long, and they were going to consider 40 bills. Okay. I mean, again, how seriously are we considering these 40 bills? How much have we delved into all of this? Do we know what we're passing, or is it just, through the gate, push as much sausage into the casing as is humanly possible? It's the exact opposite of sort of considered statesmanship, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, Jane said it putting party politics aside, any supermajority is not good for governance, period. It's not good for citizen involvement, and that's what we have now. Okay, so I'm going to turn back to Matt. Matt, you started to talk a bit about the rebuilding in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. Sanibel in particular has a really difficult task ahead. And Sanibel is also one of the communities in the state of Florida that's been most proactive about sound growth and development. And I'm just wondering if any of the pending legislation will directly impact the rebuilding effort. I believe you guys had a gathering on resiliency and rebuilding yesterday evening, right? So how are you thinking about that as this legislation is progressing?
Absolutely. We're really concerned with a lot of these bills coming through when we're talking about stifling of citizen engagement, and especially some of the bills that we're seeing that are attempting to preempt some of the local government decisions. What we've seen with the Sanibel plan specifically is that when you think about the future and you plan to be in the area that you want to live in for a long time, and not just about you specifically, but future generations, and you make considerations based on the longevity of the area that you're designing plans around, it pays off. On Sanibel, we've been protecting nature, and we saw in Hurricane Ian that nature protected us. I can say undoubtedly that that storm would have been much worse if we had fully built out that island and did not have the protection of oyster reefs, did not have the protection of mangrove fringes and large tracts of conservation land on that area that prevented the storm surge from completely eradicating a lot of the dwellings on that island. So when we're talking about some of these bills that are preventing local leaders from making decisions on everything from water quality to single-use plastics, it really seems like a slap in the face to people who have been shining examples of local governance and how development can work hand in hand with smart planning, and how that can work for into perpetuity. We have tons of people who live on Sanibel. We have an amazing tourism-based economy on Sanibel. People want to come and visit here. And what we've seen is that those natural resources, they fund our economy, they drive tourism, they make our quality of life better, and they are really supportive of how we live our lives as Floridians down here in Southwest Florida. So when you're seeing some of these bills that have a business ability to stand in the way of local decisions because it's going to cost them business, that's really scary to me, because I think that if that was around in the 60s and 70s when the Sanibel plan was going into place, of course, Dairy Queen would have been able to make an argument that by virtue of not having the ability to put 6 locations on Sanibel Island, you're costing them business. And there's all these ridiculous arguments that you're able to say in the short term, it may be costing you money, but in the long term, it's absolutely protecting you and gaining you money. And for this to come down to one adjudicator saying, yes, there were some losses here, so you're not able to protect your own people, that's really scary. And we're in a place where our local leaders really understand the protections that are in place for land use, for water quality, for a lot of these things. On Sanibel specifically, our local leaders and our local business leaders have been really active trying to protect our water quality, especially since 2018 when we had that massive red tide that lasted for months. It deposited millions of tons of dead sea life on our shores. It cost millions of dollars for the city to clean up, and that's taxpayer dollars that are going to then try to fund these cleanup efforts from the decisions that are being made around development and around pollution. So I think that if we're going to be talking about preemption, when a business can come in and say, hey, you're going to cost me money, don't pass that legislation. What about the taxpayers who also want to come in and say, this decision is going to end up costing me money in the long run with cleanup costs, with rebuild costs, with all of these other compounding factors that aren't captured. We're not seeing that aired up in Tallahassee. And we have these issues where we don't have time to wait for Tallahassee to make decisions about our land use and our environments in our communities that we live in, we work in, we play in, and we know these environments better than anyone because we're the ones that are in them every day. So if we have a group of people and our local leaders and our business community and citizens who stand up and say, this is what we understand needs to happen to protect our community and protect our environment and protect our way of life, I think that's where the power should lie, and it shouldn't be preempted by Tallahassee. And it's unfortunate that it doesn't seem like all of our leaders in Tallahassee feel the same way.
Yeah, there's a lot of lip service to home rule and local control, but when sessions end, that does not seem to apply, unfortunately. Thanks, Matt.
So Matt, I'm so glad you brought up that preemption one, because one of the sponsors of that bill is a former mayor of a small town. It's like things that make you go,
Yeah, you got to wonder.
So Jane, you are in Tallahassee, steeped in it for another month. What is your outlook for the second half of session? What can we expect?
Yeah, so the first half of session is, usually a lot of policy committees, a lot of opportunity to, talk to the various committees. And now is when it starts to get scary, because now it's a lot of, behind closed doors, backroom deals, sausage making is happening, where it is very much behind closed doors. The public is not really engaged in that process. The policy committees start to wrap up and come to an end. And now you've just got to have your ear to the ground. If you're in the biz like I am, you've got to still make sure that you're meeting with all the lawmakers and watching things very carefully, because this is when, if a bill, for example, like that preemption on land use initiatives, that prohibition on land use initiatives, even though that may have stalled, this is when you might see it get tucked into some other bill. So that's what you've really got to watch out for. So it just gets a little bit more challenging because it's not so open. So I'm ready.
Talk a little more about the land use initiatives preemption. So that would be voter referendums potentially would be.
That's right. Yeah. So, increasingly citizens throughout the state of Florida are finding themselves, not able to litigate, really not able to lobby on these issues. And so kind of the last tool in the toolbox is to get a whole bunch of petitions signed and have an initiative placed on your ballot that has to do with local land development regulations. So a very common example, and my hometown of city of St. Augustine Beach did this a while ago. They had a height restriction for buildings along the beach of 35 feet. It was a height limitation that they imposed. And that was done, not through lobbying the city council members, because that wasn't working. It was a citizen referendum process where they got the requisite number of signatures, placed the item on the ballot, and it passed with, overwhelming support, because people really do want a say in the character of their community. So that's just one example. And the bill that was being proposed, I believe the representative was Garcia from Miami-Dade, would have and the Senate sponsor was Rodriguez, also from Miami-Dade. It would have prohibited those sorts of referendum processes.
Yeah, really concerning stuff. And we'll be watching to see if that reemerges as the session continues on. So thank you for flagging that. And the other bills that Gil talked about at the outset here are definitely going to be on our radar. So we're going to try to get to some audience questions now. I know we have folks watching live on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any questions about what we've been discussing about growth-related legislation this session in Tallahassee, please pop them into the chat on Facebook or YouTube, and we can take some questions right now in the 10 or so minutes we have left. Okay, Lauren Janitis. Hi, Lauren. Welcome. She wants to know, what is the process for when and if a bill would be heard? Jane, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. So once you finally get a bill drafted and you've got a sponsor both on the House and the Senate side, then comes the really fun part of making sure that it actually gets to its first committee stop. And, unfortunately, this is where we see a lot of good bills die on the vine. We had some really really good ones, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, and other bills that we were really enthusiastic about at the beginning of the session. But because we have a supermajority controlled by one party, if that party doesn't want to hear that bill and wants to make sure that it never sees the light of day, all they have to do is never agenda the item for its first committee stop, and poof, it's over. So it needs to go through all the committee stops. And then it goes to the House and the Senate floor. And if the governor can sign it into law, but if he doesn't sign it, physically into law, it will automatically become effective. Usually the effective date is July 1st of following the session.
Okay, thanks for walking us through that. We can take another question from the audience now. All right, Rosalie Hewins. Hi, Rosalie. Matt, you mentioned tools that are available to us. What are they? Kind of general, so take that as you want.
Yeah, thanks, Rosalie. The tools that I was referencing are really allowed for that public participation. So currently they are everything from using the lawsuits that are available to us now when it comes to that, when having a smart lawsuit brought to challenge a comprehensive land use change or a zoning change or something like that. But it's less than that too. I mean, your voice is your biggest tool that you have. So whether that's participating in some of the concentrated efforts that Friends of the Everglades or SCCF or some of the other groups put on when they put out action alerts and gets you to contact your local representative or your senator, or even just doing that on your own volition and picking up the phone. We hear constantly that our representatives are actually really care about what is being said to them, whether or not they're on the other end of the phone when you call in. Their staff members are telling them what people are talking about because it matters, and they're concerned about what their constituents are saying. So I don't think you can ever underestimate the power of an email, or especially a phone call, if something's important to you. And that participation and that public voice is one of the largest tools that we have in a democracy. So to see some of these bills that are trying to strip those away is really horrifying.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I'm always stunned by how many people don't know who their elected representative or senator is, which is really sad and frustrating. But I doubt that that's part of any of this engaged group. But I would strongly encourage you to find out who not only your local elected officials are, but who are your representatives at the state level, and call them. Emails are fine, but quite frankly, it's kind of easy to delete an email. I would strongly encourage you to pick up the phone and call them. As Eve noted, we're just halfway through the session. There is still time to put the brakes on some of these really bad bills. So pick up the phone and call your lawmakers to get them to pay attention to these issues.
Totally agree. And I know Thousand Friends of Florida and SCCF and Friends of the Everglades all do action alerts. We want to make it easy for you to send that email, but if you can also call, that's really going to have a bigger impact, and do that wherever you can, especially if it's your local.
If I could reference back to something that Matt said, which I think is important in this context as well. One of the big things we know over on the West Coast has been the involvement of businesses, local business leaders in some of these issues. It's real easy, again, for your local representative to delete your email. But if your local business community understands, how these bills are going to cause maybe problems for them, ultimately, for their bottom line, their business, that sort of thing. If you have an involved local business community, I think you're going to have maybe a lot more of an audience in Tallahassee, because that's who, a lot of these legislators really will listen to. The local business community, the local business leaders who are saying, why are we doing this? This is a bad idea. Now, that might be a tough sell, like on Senate Bill 170, which would preempt local authority over local businesses, that sort of thing. But if you have an engaged local business community that demands action, that demands, some of this legislation, sees it, understands that it's bad, understand the long-term ramifications likely to occur when and if this legislation is passed, and you can get them involved in the process, that might be another avenue as well. You know what I mean? Again, it's like the more the merrier, but some voices tend to be listened to maybe a little more closely and up in Tallahassee than others. And again, I think it's been hugely beneficial for the West Coast to have the business community involved as it has been. And anywhere that can be sort of nurtured, I think it's a bonus.
Absolutely. I think that's a point well taken, Gil, that the business community is not a monolith, and the business community has competing interests, and a lot of them understand the economics of the environment and understand the economics of protecting our natural resources, because at the end of the day, most of our business community relies on protecting those natural resources. So it's important to engage with your local chamber of commerce, your friends that own businesses, and get them to understand how important protecting our economy, our environment, and our ecology is to Florida, and they all go hand in hand.
It's a really important point, and I think it's important to remember that this is how we got to the point where the governor started issuing executive orders on the environment, because in 2018, when he was running for election, there was a dire toxic algae crisis that affected Southwest Florida, affected the east coast of Florida, and he ran on that platform and then issued the first executive order addressing some of the issues. However, it's the follow through that we need. And that executive order absolutely was prompted by the economic fallout from that crisis. We saw businesses on both coasts crippled. And I know the Sanibel Captiva Chamber of Commerce has been vocal and proactive. It's great when chambers of commerce can see the long economic view and really go to bat on that. So thanks for mentioning it. All right, we can take another question or comment now. Okay, Paula McLeese says, don't forget about the Florida right-to-clean-water.org initiative. This is the answer to the problem. Make it a law to stop polluters by holding the state agencies accountable. Thank you, Paula. Friends of the Everglades and VoteWater are actually petition signature locations for that initiative. We agree it's really important. You can go to the website, print out your own petition and download it. Jane, I know you were interested in this. Do you want to talk about how it ties in with some of what we've talked about today?
Yeah, as I mentioned, increasingly our tools are becoming really limited. So I'm a strong proponent personally of this initiative. I'm an ambassador for the petition process up in Northeast Florida, and I would strongly encourage everyone to, print up a bunch of copies, get them in, and send them in, because they need a lot of signatures to make this happen. And I think it's an innovative tactic that has been used in other parts of the country. And it's time that Florida recognize its utility here.
Definitely. And just to orient folks who may not be aware, this is a proposed constitutional amendment for the 2024 ballot. And it would essentially give us another legal tool for challenging challenging issues that have a negative impact on water in Florida. It might sound a little bit out there, giving nature rights, but it's really a very practical legal tool, and it's important, and we support it. Okay, do we have any more questions that we can pop in? Yes, one more. Casey Niffen. Hi, Casey. Thanks for joining us. Casey asks, do you expect that the supermajority in the legislature would override a veto by the governor on any of these bad bills? Jane, you're shaking your head. Why don't you take it?
No, I don't think we've seen a more harmonious legislature and governor working together lockstep. There's the disconnect with the executive order that we talked about, but I really don't see this happening. It is kind of an unusual circumstance to have the supermajority, and that is veto proof, but I just don't see that happening, mostly because of the incredible political aspirations that Governor DeSantis has. There's a lot of momentum behind him, making him look good. And that obviously would be really bad optics. And I don't see the House or Senate doing that.
And that's the reason it's going to be so interesting to see how this conflict between legislation that's moving and the executive order plays out. So stay tuned. Okay, so with the few minutes we have left, I think I'm going to start with you, Gil, and then we'll go around the horn with just some final takeaways. And Gil, I just want to open it up to you by pointing out that during the legislative session, we often have to play defense on bad legislation. That's what we've spent the last hour talking about largely. What do you think it will take to get some good legislation to gain traction in Tallahassee?
I hate to think it's going to take another crisis, but maybe it will. I mean, to reference what we talked about earlier, legislators, and the people that they hear from have to understand how all these issues are related. We talk about the Session of Sprawl. Why do we oppose sprawl? Do we oppose sprawl because we don't like the way it looks, or we don't like the traffic? I mean, those are aspects of why people haven't had issues with it. We oppose sprawl because, again, reckless planning leads to more environmental problems. Okay, it leads to more runoff. It leads to more nutrients in the water. It leads to more destruction of habitat. Okay, Tallahassee, the legislators there are, being lobbied constantly by the sprawl industry that wants more access, fewer restrictions, fewer rules. And again, it's an extraordinarily politically powerful industry because it's an extraordinarily profitable industry. You don't build homes in Florida and have them sit empty for 6 months because you can't sell it. That's not how it works. So we need to, sort of on the whole, understand that when it comes to comprehensive planning, when it comes to growth, it's going to happen. We're going to have more growth. We just are. Okay. I know 1,000 Friends of Florida has put out a series of reports, Florida 2070. We can either grow smartly or we can grow stupidly. And what happens if we grow stupidly? And the legislation that we're talking about, does this represent smart growth? Does this represent responsible growth? Or does it represent the opposite? And if it is the opposite, what's it going to do? What's the effect going to be? And I think we can all game out, what that effect is going to be. I think we know. But their short-term thinking seems to predominate. The idea, short-term profits, short-term, we want this, that sort of thing. You have to take the longer view. And unfortunately, the longer view comes into focus at times of crisis. So like I say, I hate to say we're going to have another crisis, but maybe we will. I don't know.
Thanks, Gil. Jane, final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, when I was in law school, my mentor, Richard Grosso, had this bumper sticker up on the wall that said, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." And that's always kind of stuck with me. And so for everyone who's listening into this, you're paying attention. And that's half the battle. We've got so many people in Florida who've recently moved here. They don't understand the ecosystem of this amazing state, and they're functioning with little blinders on, thinking they can do the same thing here that they did in Minnesota or Ohio or New Jersey. And this is not New Jersey. We need to be careful of how we treat this very fragile, beautiful state. And so paying attention, really, in my opinion, is half the battle. I'm so glad that we have people watching this and are engaged and outraged, and hopefully you can channel that energy into positive momentum by picking up the phone and calling your lawmaker and telling them to do the right thing.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for all you're doing in Tallahassee this session. Matt, final words from you?
Yeah, I think it's going to be important to just keep up the momentum. We're about a little over halfway through session right now, but the hard work comes at the end of session. There's going to be a lot of action alerts once we start seeing how these bills develop, what's being snuck into the bills in the 11th hour. Don't expect the same amount of energy or activity that we saw in the first half of session to follow through, because as we get closer to session, there's going to be even more calls to senators that are needed and representatives, even more emails sent. And that's before the veto campaigns begin. So I think it's going to be a slog and it's going to be a lot of work, but we need all hands on deck here to really pull together if we want to see any traction in some of the concerns we have about these bills. So stay outraged, stay paying attention, and stay following all of us.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks for everything Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation does, even as you're still in recovery mode after Hurricane Ian. Give you a lot of credit for juggling these priorities. So If we're sending you an email about a bill from Friends of the Everglades or 1,000 Friends of Florida or SCCF, this is not alarmist. We're really concerned. We need you to weigh in. We need you to make those phone calls. We promise to keep you informed. I want to thank all of our panelists here for joining us over the last hour. I want to thank the audience for listening in. If you want more information, you can go to any of our websites. Ours is everglades.org. And we'll rejoin in a month to see where some of these issues land. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.